Hello and welcome to episode 22 of Webflail, the podcast dedicated to uncovering the greatest failures behind the greatest webflowers, because success often comes after learning from many failures. I'm your host, Jack, a failure connoisseur, and today my guest is Mason Poe. Mason is the founder and builder at Edgar Allen Studio. He is a formidable runner. He's the founder of Webflow Cafe, and you may have seen him speak at Webflow Conf about growing a Webflow business through collaboration. Mason, thanks so much for coming on the Webflow podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
I am so excited to see the man that is of the studio who created Let Her Run. So if anyone who's listening hasn't heard of Let Her Run, shame on you, but it is possibly the coolest Webflow website I have ever seen. So to kick this off, what I wondered is if you could tell us a little bit about the story of the project, because I know story is such a big part of Edgar Allen, and I think that will give us a really good flavor of you and the studio.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Let Her Run actually came to me on a run. I didn't name it at that point. It was actually named by one of our lead visual developers by his daughter. And we were trying to come up with a name, and he was like, what would you name it? And she said, Let Her Run. And so that's where the name came from. But it was really just an idea of trying to think about like, we had this new brand, and we had kind of just some stuff that we wanted to play with in terms of the visual language. And my kids have been playing, what is it, Among Us? And we were thinking like the EA character sort of looked like one of the Among Us characters. And we were like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if we sort of dropped it into a world that was made up of the letter forms of Edgar Allen? And then it just kind of grew from there. And in fact, I know like, I think we could have probably a whole episode on just what I'd say are like failures of building that project. If you had told me a year ago that it was going to take a year to complete, then I don't know if we would have started it. But we definitely learned a whole lot. And, it was trying to think about how to, um, you know, how to take a different approach to Webflow and how to take a different approach to storytelling. And yeah, and so you'd asked as well about like, the kind of the roots of Edgar Allen. And I think for me, what I try to think about is that, story is the most fundamental way in which we come to know the world. It's how we learn as children and how we hope to be remembered when we're gone. And it's a mechanism that's often associated with what I'd say is like storytelling. But if you can take a step back and think more in terms of story listening and how to look at like the structure of story and understanding like that story is just made of characters that have a point of tension in which they're trying to address, then you can start to pull a lot of power out of that, and especially start to apply that into design work. And in fact, like, within design, we often talk about the customer journey, and journey is a shape of story. But you could also think about, like there's the customer bear at the door. So there's like about 14 general shapes of a story. Bear at the door is one where it's like something bad has just happened, and what are you going to do? Or, it's like what is it? The mirage, where it's like there's something just over the horizon that you're trying to get to. And yeah, but there's a whole lot of ways to be able to look at story, and not just in terms of storytelling, but really in terms of story having.
It's such an interesting, excuse me, I'm going to have to cough there. It's such an interesting like start to an agency, because I think a lot of agencies don't necessarily think about their name as carefully as Edgar Allen has for you, and like what it kind of how that tells the story of your agency as well. Can you give us a little bit of a flavor as to like why the name? Because I guess you get asked this the whole time because you're like, wait, you're Mason Poe. Why is it called Edgar Allen? But can I just
Yeah.
be that annoying guy just for anyone that is also wondering that question as well?
Yeah. It was again, um I'm very thesis driven. And so again, trying to start with this idea of being story driven. I will say that I didn't name the agency. That was actually a friend of mine, Brandon Barr. Uh, and naming something is really difficult. But at the time, what I wanted was something that felt incredibly human. I think that in technology, sometimes we can become so enamored with the tech or like this sort of like shiny object type of thing, or things that, feel like rocket ships, that we can forget that the main thing we're just trying to do is have one person talk with another, and that they can start to understand one another. And I think that authors do a great job of that. Also, yes, my last name is Poe, and people have always asked me like, are you related? And I can say now that I am related.
And coming off the back of what you just said there, I mean, Webflow is an amazing tool to bring your ideas to life. But I think maybe part of the problem with Webflow is that it's so easy to bring things to life. But unless you've thought carefully about the ideas
Mm.
in the content stage, then you can kind of just bring together a Frankenstein to life, and that's not what we want. And I've noticed that a lot of people talk about the ease of use of Webflow,
Mm.
et cetera, but actually sometimes that overlooks the importance of the steps before. Can you talk to us a little bit about storytelling if someone's
Mm.
new to Webflow and they're like, I don't know what he's talking
Yeah.
about, like, and
Yeah.
I make websites. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I've been working in Webflow for almost 8 years, and Edgar Allen as a business is almost 10 years old. And again, we started with this thesis of trying to be story driven. Very quickly, I learned that like our ability to be really great listeners and then be able to react within the market was inhibited by the tools that we use. Sort of the Marshall McLuhan idea here of the medium is the message. And so if your medium limits how you can go and have an idea and be able to turn that around, then you're not going to be able to do as much. And so I started looking at like what's a tool that we could use to just shorten that distance. And I looked at a lot of different tools. I looked at, there was Muse at the time from Adobe, and then there was like this AI thing and like all of these different things. And they and I even found Webflow. And I didn't believe in Webflow because I've seen a lot of marketing in my career, and it just all felt a little too good to be true. But what I ended up finding was actually a video from Sergey talking about how Webflow didn't get into Y Combinator and their mission, and like really trying to that like what they were trying to do is not build a web development product. What they're trying to do is build a way for people to express themselves on the web. And if there's anything that I think that, you know, that we're guilty of within the Webflow community is sometimes we can become so enamored with the tool, and that we can become so enamored with like, you know, the the shiny things, and that we can forget that again, we're just trying to help one person talk with another, one person, understand another. Obviously, those are through marketing websites or through kind of like commercial means, but that's the end goal. And I see that the first wave for Webflow has really been, and I've talked about this. I talked about this on like the Visual FFM, has been for designers that are technical. I see the next two waves is really and what I'm very excited about is for non-technical authors and really for writers. And I think that's when we are able to really empower writers to feel as comfortable in Webflow as they do in say like Google Slides, then I think that's going to be a real tipping point. And I think the other group that I'm very excited about is developers. If there's anything that I think has maybe held Webflow back, it's the notion of no code. No code is a fantastic way to learn about programming, but at some point, like it's great to be able to have people who know how to code within your project. And so we have a thesis which we call some code, or Webflow Plus. And so it's Webflow Plus, how we can bring in writers, and Webflow Plus, how we can bring in, traditional developers. And that was a big part of even Letter Run is like that project. It's a Webflow project. But there's a ton of React code in there. I mean, there's a ton of just like code. And what we wanted to do is there, and I think the shows just sort of the power of moving beyond no code is that you can have what are these swim lanes of responsibility. So you can have a swim lane which is for content, you can have a swim lane which is for development, you can have a swim lane which is for the visual development part of this, which is like UI elements, how it all comes together, and that Webflow can become this sort of watering hole that everyone comes to be able to work.
I love that concept of a watering hole, that it's kind of like the final point where all these different animals come together so that they
Yep.
can kind of coexist in
That's
harmony.
exactly it. Yeah.
And I've heard Nelson, I think you were talking to Pixel Geek on YouTube, one of the interviews that I watched, where you talked about how Webflow is kind of the last 10%, maybe if that, of a web design project. Like, it's actually the storytelling and the brand identity and the content design and stuff. It's like, and Nelson compared it to a film set.
Yep.
But actually, it's like once the cameras are rolling, that's kind of what you see with Webflow. But actually, costume design and like prop making and all of that other stuff needs to come before. So I love this analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really gets into just why it's going to be so amazing when more writers start becoming involved with web design. And that, think about creating a movie. Like, the first thing you do is you create a script and you create an idea. And I think that something I've learned in my career is that to elevate as a designer, you really have to elevate as a writer. And someone that I really admire is like David from the Webflow team. Like, he's got his weekly email and he's just like an amazing writer. And it's about like how to be able to get those ideas out in a written form so that like visually, then you can start to react to those. And yeah, for our projects, it's funny. It's like we're known as a Webflow agency, and Webflow, it's a big part of what we do. It's a differentiator, but now it's maybe more like 20 to 30% of our total kind of projects, but it's about 10 to 15% of any individual project.
Interesting. So can I just focus in on someone that's starting out on Webflow and it's hearing all this and it's like, okay, this Mason guy, I definitely resonate with what he's saying, because I'm trying to make websites, but I don't really know what they're about until I'm in the Webflow designer and I feel like everything's wrong. I need to focus more on the content side of things. How should they begin thinking about that?
I think it's a really good question. And what I would say is this. And so I had two talks at Webflow conference this year. And, one was around the 3D Clubhouse of Let Her Run. And the other one was with Matt and Emily on growing through collaboration. And within both of those, if there's one thematic, it's that you don't have to go it alone. So I think it's how to go in and start to, one, recognize what your strengths are. And I think it's okay to go super deep, get like super into the details. Like, you don't have to jump to being, like a content designer or like understanding like this crazy stuff that I'm talking about, like, building a story-driven organization or anything along those lines. Like, just get really, really good at what I would say is like building a wedge. So my background is like, I actually came up, I studied English and philosophy in school. There's nothing that I can do kind of like that. I just like studied the stuff that I was interested in. But I started banging my head on the keyboard at the computer lab and started trying to think about, like, I was like, oh, this internet thing seems cool and I want to build it. And I started working in a program called Flash. And so I became an expert in Flash. And as someone that doesn't have a design background, being able to have a small wedge where you can say, like, I can solve this very specific problem for you. And at that time, it was like, I was a really great like Flash designer and developer, and I could design and build and pop into a project. And I was able to then go and like, work in big agencies and do a bunch of stuff without having, like, at that time was the traditional background. And so it's okay to like jump into Webflow and become an expert and then, really own that craft. But then there becomes a point where, it's like, okay, now who do I start to work with and how do I start to expand outside of that? And if there is an analogy that I would make, it's like, and I love music. So I listen to a ton of music. We were just talking or whatever, but I had a radio show in college. I grew up on college radio. My radio show in college was super nerdy. It was like an ambient show. And so it's just like a bunch of weird stuff. But when you're becoming a musician, the first thing you do is you learn your instrument, and then the second thing you do is you learn who to play with, and then you start to learn like what you want to be able to say through that instrument. And so I think that's kind of like the stepped process that people can start to look at and think about, like a roadmap for, like, okay, how do I go from being alone in my basement, which is where I started learning this tool, to being successful and being paid for it and being able to have a career.
I love that advice though, that you don't actually need to know everything else. Like, you don't need to play all the other
Yep.
instruments, even if they are necessary to create the sound that you want. You can actually just lean on people who may have those skill sets. And I would also add that if you're like, how should I think about content and how do I start writing and stuff, I think writing a newsletter for me
Mhm.
has been a great forcing function to just write something every single week. And I know that's not going into a website, but
Yep.
it actually does just force you to think, okay, who am I writing for? What am I trying to communicate? And how can I
Yep.
do that better through what I write? So um, I know that you're a big fan of, I mean, the Edgar Allen blog is legendary. And you also personally write on that blog as well.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and, the educational side of Edgar Allen?
Yeah, I think what we try to look at is just documenting what we're learning. And so if you see a lot of stuff on there, it's like we're learning a lot, and we're kind of like going up to the edges of what we know and then trying to come back to be able to share that with other people. And yeah, and then I think if back to that previous idea, if there's feedback that I have for the Webflow community or something that I see that I think as a group that we could be better at, is that Webflow, or if there's sort of a myth, it's that you don't have to be just you don't have to do everything. You don't have to be just a solopreneur. And that I think career, Webflow will grow and that your career will grow as you find other people to work with. And that looking at like those, building those relationships is really where I've found success. And that, I think that at the end of the day, the business, it's a relationship business. And so one way to build those relationships is just to try to be helpful. And so if, it's like as we're learning stuff, if we can go and document that and then put it up on the blog or share it out on Twitter, or, have a newsletter, then that's one way to just have that back and forth and start to break out of like our own little bubble and find more people to work with.
I absolutely love this idea of kind of giving more than you're taking. And I feel like there's a lot of people who I've met in the Webflow community who have that similar mindset where it's like, yeah, sure, I'll hop on a call and chat to you about,
Yeah.
how I've got to where I am, and maybe that will help you, and or with code or whatever. But
Mhm.
I think I always come back to this analogy of a chef like Gordon Ramsay. He's showing you how to make his secret sauce, and as a result, everyone's like, wow, this guy's amazing. But then he gets all these opportunities as a result of that.
Yeah.
He's going to LA to set up restaurants now and all of this kind of thing. And I just
Yep.
think if everyone thinks more like Gordon Ramsay, minus the swearing and the forehead lines, we're all going to be better off in the community. So I absolutely love, your agency feels to me like it's the leading agency for that side of things, and I can only hope more agencies follow suit. It's really cool.
Yeah. I think something that I see is that for Webflow to grow, what we're talking about isn't just like, there's kind of like platform driven businesses, and I've seen this in the past where like, WordPress or AEM or even just like the digital agency side of the business, it's always like there's a platform component. And that for us to grow the business, we really have to grow like how these businesses work. And that, this notion of a rising tide lifts all ships type of thing. And so I think that if there's a wonderful spirit and just like such a beautiful spirit within the Webflow community, it's that I think a lot of people recognize this, and a lot of people recognize that, hey, it's not us competing necessarily just against like each other on like who's going to go and win this particular Webflow build. It's like, how can we go in and make this platform so attractive that, it's really starting to outpace what, these other platforms can do. So it's WordPress, AEM, Sitecore, like all of that type of stuff. And that for us as an agency, there was a time where, so for about the first, I would say 5 to 6 years, we actually didn't tell anyone that we worked in Webflow. It was our secret sauce. And it was interesting. It was like once I started telling more people, because I wanted to just like win those projects and then be like, and we're doing it in Webflow, like, but once we, yeah, yeah. Um, but it was like once we came out of the sort of metaphorical closet of like being able to tell more, and what I've learned is just like the more that we share, and we share some on like the tool side of it, but I think the thing that I'm trying to work with a lot of people on is really more on the business side, and just to be able to coach up. Like, I mean, I send people like our entire estimates sometimes. Like I've sent this to just like a handful of people to be able to show like, okay, this is what it looks like. And I'm not trying to flex here. I mean, they're really good estimates, but I'm trying to show like, here's how we're breaking down a project. Here's how we're staffing for that project. And here's how we're charging for that project. And here's how we're delivering like at a certain level of service. And so if we can demystify that sort of dark art of the business, then, we're going to be racing towards the top as opposed to racing towards the bottom.
I love that. That is the quote of the episode right there.
Uh,
And we're not even halfway. Thank you for dropping these nuggets. I hope if there are any agency owners listening, please do have a think about this, because I really think that this rising tide lift all boats
Yep.
concept is just so fundamental to the success of Webflow generally.
Yeah.
Not just Webflow as a platform, but just all of us are better off.
Sure. And I mean, just like, again, like I'm, there is definitely a chorus of people that are talking about this, and just everything from Matt from 80/20 to, Hal, who's just, I think he's about a year in on his agency. But, a lot of people that are kind of coming together to talk about just the business side of Webflow. And I actually have an idea that I'm kind of tinkering around with and starting to incubate on how to make this more real, and how to have what I would say is like the no BS side of the business. Because all too often, if the other thing that I can see is that these magic carpet rides get sold, where it's like, oh, if you just do these 5 things, then you're going to have a successful business. And that's really not it. It's more like, how to have a support system and how to have maybe feedback on the business side of things, so that you can understand, like, because there's no one tool that's going to be the panacea to anything. There's no one, like, is it a fixed fee approach? Is it like, charging value-based pricing, or like or like how to approach your employee handbook? That's something I'm working on a lot right now. Or how to approach your contracts, or all of this stuff. Like it's just as varied as like, what's the, if you look at like all the JavaScript libraries that are out there, that's just like one language that has like thousands of libraries, if not even more than that, that are all trying to do really different things, but are all taking like very different approaches. And so trying to have, I think, a space to have those types of conversations, I think, will be important as the community grows.
Interesting. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that in the coming
Yeah,
year.
so that's
I'm
just a
sure.
teaser. That's a
Yeah,
teaser. So you heard
teaser.
it here
Heard it here
first.
first, guys. Subscribe to Webflow. No, joking. We get all the Webflow gas. Okay, I'm never going to say that again. So let's get into your 3 failures now. You're at your zenith with Edgar Allen, but let's kind of rewind the clock and go into these failures. So tell me about failure number 1, about failing the 3rd grade.
Sure, and it's interesting. So one, I'm so excited to be here, and that when you asked me about my 3 failures, I think one of the things that I mentioned is just that I have kind of like a complicated history with failure, and and it's like, I love the name of Webflail. And it's like, I really get into words. And the thing that I do is like, I go on a run and I listen to podcasts and I listen to music, and I just like have stuff that like just sort of wraps around in my head. And the idea of flail is so incredibly powerful. And as I've listened to your episodes, I mean, I listened to the first one with Ben Skalinsky. I read like I spell, so I'm going to get into this whole like my 3rd grade story here in a little bit. But I don't know if I'm saying his name right. And then Matt Evans and Melissa Mendez. I mean, you've had like so many amazing people on here, and so just to like kind of be within that group, it's an honor. But I think that as I think of failure, I think it's something that should be kind of avoided at all costs. And like, I don't know, I think about if I worry about anything, it's like that we celebrate failure too much, or that there's this myth that you have to have immense pain to have immense success. And I don't think that's necessarily it. Also, God, I hope this isn't the zenith, because we still have a long way to go. I feel like I feel like I've, been in we've been building this agency for 10 years now, and just now figuring out like what we're doing. So anyone that's just getting started, um, it takes a while. And even then, like I know about I'm like a blues musician, I know like three chords and I just repeat those chords all the time. And so if you're hearing zingers, it's like stuff that I just like I've got about seven things that I say. Um, but I think that the thing that I worry about in terms of celebrating failure is that like failure is an end point, and that if you going even back to like the etymology of the word, like it's a 12th century word, that really it comes from the idea of an ending. And what I love about, and I have like these three failures, and so as I thought about like what to talk about today, and I'll go through each one. The first one does start in the third grade. I failed the third grade miserably. But the thing that I love, and I love what you're doing here, is this idea of a flail, and a flail is where it's just sort of like there's mistakes and there's challenges, but it's about a process and it's about growing. And so with the failures, what I wanted to do is kind of back up and say like, okay, here's where there was a challenge, and then here's like where I'd moved past it, and kind of like, and I know this is like I'm just kind of I have a lot of ideas, and so if there's anything that I struggle with, it's sometimes I can have very strong ideas, and I think if there is if there's a thing that I'd love for you to be able to take away from today's conversation, it's to be like a connoisseur of failure, which is like a different type of spin on this. But when I think about failure, it goes back to even like how so when I was in college, I climbed a lot. And in climbing, one of the things you do is you do talk about failure quite a bit. And you talk about like trying not to have anchors fail. So when you're climbing up, you want to be able to put in protection, and you talk about like the things that you don't want that to happen, because if there is a failure, then it can be really bad. And especially now, um, if I fail, then a lot of people get hurt. Um, and I don't want that to happen. And so I work a lot to try to address that. Um, if I was to go back to the very beginning of what I was talking about in terms of like, my first big failure that I think about, it's, I've always struggled within school. In third grade, so I went to probably like, I don't know how many different schools through my quote unquote academic career. I don't know how academic it always was, but I'm wildly dyslexic, and I just kind of think about things differently. I sort of think about things probably all at once, which can make reading difficult and reading comprehension really difficult. And like I was in this class and I wasn't learning, and so like by about mid-year, I spent like the rest of the class like literally underneath my desk. Like I would come to the classroom and I would just like sit under my desk, and that was like that was a big failure, and just in terms of like I think experiencing failure as being told you're a failure. And so it's like I was making straight F's. I was like not able to succeed within this environment, and struggling to just like, I mean, as a kid, like you're just like trying to do good stuff and then just not being able to do that. If I was to, you know, think about it a little bit more, I think the one thing that it did do is it like and I think just school in general is like it probably made me better at sales, and it made me better at kind of like emotional intuition, because I always had to kind of figure out like what were the motives of my teachers, what were they really sort of after, and how could I understand them first as people so that I can understand what they were trying to do. And it's really starting with that kind of like point of empathy for my teachers. But yeah, I think that's my first sort of snapshot at failure. The one great thing about third grade is that um and I guess it gets back to this sort of sales thing, but they had this thing where they had a competition for selling raffle tickets. And so, I hadn't really like, I'm not great at like ball sports. So I wasn't like killing it on the kickball field or anything. But I got for whatever really fired up about selling raffle tickets. And they had this Garfield phone that for the person that sold the most raffle tickets, you got the Garfield phone. And so I like just pounded the pavement and I just like sold the heck out of these things. I don't know like how many like hundreds of dollars that I sold, but I sold the most out of the whole school and I uh won the Garfield phone. But I think the failure there, the thing that I was able to work through is just basically starting to understand that like just because this was being projected onto me, that it's not who I have to be, and that I can recognize the things that I'm not good at, and then just like continue to kind of work through those.
Fascinating response here. So, can I just say what I've heard back to you just so I can make sure I understand? So, what you're saying is that while failure suggests an end, a flailure suggests a bit of a splash in the water before finally coming up, and then, going on from there. And that school was pretty hard because school is not designed for people who don't fit into a box. And it sounds like you didn't fit into the required box at your school, and that you realized that if you could understand the individual teacher's needs, then you could ensure that you could have like a working relationship even as a child,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Like
that you could get the best grades, I guess, than
yeah, like
whatever.
I could just I could get them to sort of like me or sort of work with me. And yeah, like I definitely didn't fit into any box. And I think that as well within the Webflow community, like one of the things that I see, and you'll talk with like a ton of different people, and there's so many people that come from so many different backgrounds that just sort of like don't fit in. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful. Even, thinking about like a tech community that's outside of San Francisco that's taken seriously. Like Webflow was one of the first companies that really like they were remote, like not everyone was in San Francisco. And I just remember thinking about how cool that was, because as a company in Atlanta, like we weren't taken seriously before COVID because, oh my gosh, we're like in Atlanta. Like we're not as good as like a company in San Francisco or New York or, Austin or something along those lines. And so I think being an outsider is definitely a big part of being like a web flower in many ways. But like that's where the innovation happens. And I think that's why you see so many different people that are coming together to try to like, bring new ideas into the marketplace.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of Webflow as a company being kind of
Mhm.
unique and a bit left field
Mhm.
in comparison to I guess, the state of affairs in tech generally. And
Mhm.
as a result, maybe that attracted, thinkers that are a little bit outside the box as well in like the tech sphere, like you say. I've never thought of it like that, though. It's interesting, that observation.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at like, I mean, the core, again, it just comes back to people. It's this relationship business. The core of the company has such great people that have been there for a while, that have set a particular tone. And this isn't to just like try to put, like every company is a mess in so many different ways. Like there's lots of different failures that are happening within a company. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really good values there that I think I've looked at and other people have looked at and try to reflect.
Also,
All right, we're back.
we're back in the game, and I'm gonna hit record. We're recording. Yes, we're recording. Okay. I could talk to you for hours, but we haven't got long. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into failure number two, if that's all right. So, tell me about failure number two. Um, at your last job, there was a time when you embraced the idea of fail harder. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. it was, I don't know, just one of these things that you sort of read and you think about. And I guess it was also my way of trying to deal with failure. Thinking about, again, like it's not that it was like failing third grade was just like such a traumatic experience, but it was definitely formative in a lot of ways. And I think that long story short, like I was fired from my last agency. And so I ended up like, mission accomplished. I failed harder. But the intent or the idea was just to not be afraid of trying things or not being afraid of like maybe like ideas. I think what I failed to see was maybe some of the like warning signs within the company and warning signs of like what an agency shouldn't be. And it was, I learned a whole lot. I think that anyone that's starting out, like, sort of my story is like I started out, I freelanced, I then went and worked at a big agency, and then I worked at sort of like a medium-sized agency, and like I was able to learn a lot about like how that world works, and I was able to do it on someone else's dime. And so at my last agency, I was able to um like understand like how to put together a pitch and what is a P&L statement, and like how to go through and hire, and all of this sort of stuff. But what I overlooked was like as I was going through the company, I was there like 6 years, is that the company changed direction 5 or 6 times. There was like multiple layoffs. There was all these warning signs of just like how I was creatively not getting along with kind of like the leadership. And I just I I didn't pay attention to some of those warning signs. And then I found myself with you know like no like basically my wife was 7 months pregnant. We had no real savings, and I was fired. And then just thinking about like what to do next. So I think that put me in a really difficult situation. And it was something that, on the one hand, like I don't know if I would have done a whole lot differently. I was able to prototype a lot of like what it means to be a story-driven company, and I kind of got a lot of these ideas from that experience. And I worked with a really good friend, Emily Leahy, who's like she sort of went back and forth with me on what how you could go and use story as a part of your strategy and how you could use it as a framing mechanism. But then, when I was kind of like outside of there, I had to reevaluate just like what was going to be next. The good part of this was there's this idea from a Rage Against the Machine song, anger is a gift. And I was pissed off. I was super mad. Like I think anyone that goes through this, like, I was told I was a bad manager. I was told that, and there was all sorts of stuff that that I was kind of experiencing at that point. Again, just like, whenever you're fired or whenever you're laid off, like you lose a whole lot more than a job. Like you lose connection to kind of your social circle. Like all of a sudden your worldview changes. Like you have no real idea of like what you wanted to do. And what I saw was that, I learned, and so the failure was just sort of failing to recognize warning signs. The failure, the way that I had flailed, was that I had started to work through just like what I wanted to see out in the world. And at the time, I didn't see another agency that I wanted to go to. It was actually, so it was 10 years ago last month that I was fired. And I sort of silently celebrate my fire anniversary, as like this big turning point. But I think the thing that I saw was just like the agency models oftentimes is broken. It's sort of focused on this hustle culture, which I think like that idea of like fail harder, of just like go until like you're
Breaking point.
yeah, your total breaking point.
Yeah.
And it's just like not healthy.
Mm.
So I think that's where I'm trying to take a step back and reevaluate just like how to again, thinking about these climbing anchors, things like have a deep appreciation for failure and then planning around it.
Mm. And I've heard you talk about, being proud that you haven't laid off any of your staff during COVID, and the importance of agency culture. And I think a lot of people see employees as disposable. And it sounds very, very different to, how Edgar Allen thinks about employees and, the relationship that you have with them. And I'm going to read you a quote that I heard you say.
Oh man.
If you want to start an agency because you love to sell work and be around amazing people, which I love from the perspective of do great work with good people and things work out. That's the general gist I've got from that. Is that
Yeah,
fair to say?
I think it is. I think that, any company is really just the sum of the people that are there. And you can go back and look at like, even Slack. I think there's like a great story there in terms of their flailings, right? So they had started off, they were doing a totally different product. But the reason why they ended up getting investment was, the VC believed in the team. And so we've focused on the team and like our what I'd say is like company community from the very beginning, and just looking at like, who do I admire and who do I want to sort of be around, and recognizing the things that I'm not very good at, and then finding other people that are really great, at those things. I will say that, as it relates to like not having layoffs and things along those lines, it's a scary time out there. And as a business owner, like I'm constantly like the big thing that I'm doing is looking at what our forecasts are. There's a lot of things that are in your control. There's things that aren't in your control. I try to plan about 6 to 8 months in advance, and I only have project visibility for maybe 30 to 120 days at best. And I think if you're not careful, like that limited visibility can create challenges for just the health of the company. And by the health of the company, I mean like not having to like lay people off or go through things that are we're having to make difficult decisions. And so yeah, and I'll also say that like I've had to fire people from Edgar Allen, and like I have a deep respect for what that means. I think trying to be a good manager is whenever that happens, it's difficult. At the same time, and I don't know if I totally believe this, but there is something that was told to me at my last agency that like there's like this notion like getting fired is the best thing that ever happened to me. And it's like, I don't know if I think there's other ways to be able to get there. Like I probably could have started Edgar Allen in different ways. But I think at the same time, like just trying to be transparent and honest with like where the company is and where different team members are. And if there is kind of a misalignment or like there's just not a good fit, then it is, I think, the more like human thing to do to be able to say like, hey, let me help you transition into a new role, and this is how we're going to start to plan for what that looks like.
And having that foresight on behalf of your employees to ensure that they're developing in the way they should.
Yeah, and my job is to not like try to trap anyone within a company. It's like really try to build everyone's careers, and I hope to be able to build those careers within Edgar Allen or like within like what we're doing. But if there becomes a point where that's just not possible, then I think it's trying to have the kind of honest conversation around what that's going to mean. And so that's just a way of saying like, you know, nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect, but trying to respect those relationships is always something that's top of mind for myself.
I love this idea of relationships being at the core of not only Edgar Allen, but actually how you're approaching the web design work itself. And there's like a real synergy with what you're talking about there. Tell me about failure number 3. When you first started your business, you were working from 4 a.m. till 11 at night. What is happening? Talk to me.
Yeah, starting something is really difficult. And as I said, like I had something to prove. I wasn't just like, in this for giggles. Like I had a thesis that I wanted to be able to bring to life. In the first year, not only were we starting a company, but I was trying to build out like our office and get all of this sort of like infrastructure spun up. We now have no office. We're totally remote. But at the time, I saw this sort of relationship between the work that we were doing and then also where we were working. And that was kind of like a proof point to say that like we're building something that was real. So within my schedule was is that I would get up around 3:30 or 4. I would be at the office, which at this time was at this place called the Goat Farm. And I would be in my chair by 4 to 4:30. And I would do all of the stuff where I needed to do that undistracted until 9. And then the rest of the team would start to come in, and then I would work from 9 until 5 or 6 on just general client work. And then at 6, I would put away my computer, and then I would get out my chop saw and start working on like actually building out the physical office. So it was like, long story short, I did a rent trade with this landlord, and I said like, hey, here's a like totally abandoned building. I will trade you the cost of like me building this out for rent if you let me go in and do this. And what ended up happening though was I got a call from my wife at one point, and the feedback was my daughter had asked if I was coming over today. And I think that was one of the things that just really like shot me to my core of like I didn't really get to see the family much for that first year. And even after that, like I I still worked. I mean, the first few years, I generally worked from about 4 in the morning until 6 at night. Uh, but I didn't work weekends, and then I didn't work at night so that I could at least see the family. But that was kind of an example. That was a failure of like me not respecting, my relationships with myself, with my family, with just like the people that were in my life and in my life outside of work. And I think it's trying to recognize that, like, yes, there's a whole lot of effort that has to be there in terms of getting something started. But pace is probably like the most important thing outside of that, because otherwise, like, you're gonna like reach burnout, or you're gonna burn out other people, and like that's stuff that just like doesn't come back. So yeah, the failure there was just starting to learn how to I balance and really it's not just balance, but I just like have those boundaries between like when I was able to do work and build things up, and then able to be present outside of work. There was like here's a total tangent, but sort of an example of like how bad things got. I was out at dinner with some friends, and it was, we just sat down, had like finished dinner or whatever, and then like I get a kick, and like I'd fallen asleep at the dinner table. And this was like at 6:30 in the evening, so not super late. And it was just an example of like the exhaustion that I was feeling at the time.
Oh wow. There's so much to this story. I mean, something that springs to mind is in regards to what you're talking about, hustle culture being really damaging, but also the gravity of the situation you were in, the amount of drive you had from being fired, the amount of anger that was fueling this. And to look at where Edgar Allen is now, I mean, was it worth it in any way? Would you, I mean, because I'm struggling to see how you would have made such monumental kind of inroads into making an agency without sacrificing a lot. I mean, even family relationships to some degree.
Sure.
Was it worth it? Or was it just like, if I could go back and turn the hands of time, I would never do that again?
It's a good question, and it's hard to say because retrospect is this thing that you sort of just really can't relive, and you can only kind of live the days that you have in front of you. I will say that again, like, it's just so difficult to get something started. And if there's something that I had to do, I talked about kind of like, Anger is a gift. I think the other thing is a gift is like forgiveness is a gift. Listening is a gift. And I think that I found that I wasn't, the other thing that I found is that I wasn't as good of a manager. I wasn't as good of like a new business person. I wasn't as good of a designer when I was that tired all the time. And I would react poorly to client situations, and client services is so stressful and so difficult. And something that I've learned is that a big part of the managing the business is managing emotions, and managing your emotions inside, and managing your clients' emotions, and managing your team's emotions. And if that emotion inside of you isn't in a good place, everything else like starts to fall apart. And
Mm.
so what I've learned is that if, because I remember like I would get an email and I'd just be like so angry about something that had been said, but I had to learn to be able to take a step back and, again, getting away from the desk is so incredibly important.
And that's the follow-up question that I had for you there. I mean, was that why running came into your life? Or were you
Oh,
always a runner?
absolutely.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I mean, like I started running with my grandfather when I was a little kid. And there's like, I'm not really good at, as I said, like ball sports or anything along those lines. Like I'm pretty good at like endurance type of things. And I didn't really like running for a long time. But I would say that as like the business has grown, I have started to run more. And, at first it was an activity that I could do with the kids. So, the kids have really kind of grown up alongside of the agency. And I could put them in the running stroller and I could go out on a Saturday and like spend time with them. And we would run to Starbucks and get food and then kind of run back. And so I could be active and be with them. And then most recently, I mean, I carve out actually my Tuesday, Thursday. I don't start work until 10 because I'm running from about 7:30 in the morning until 9, so that I can like have that think time. If there's like a thing that I want to be able to start in 2023 next year, uh, is this idea of jogger. So it's something
I
that I've
was going
been
to ask
tinkering
you
around
about
with.
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's something I've been tinkering around with for a while. It's comes from a project we did a 5K back in 2014 called Jogger. And the idea behind the brand is actually not about running far or fast or even necessarily about running, but it's just about celebrating like, activity through movement. And it's almost like as an artistic expression as opposed to just like an expression of sport. And trying to set up a challenge of, basically just getting outside and getting away from the computer. As creatives, we often think that like we address the stress and anxiety through sitting at the computer and doing the thing. What I've learned is that if I can take a step back and think about the thing or become kind of emotionally centered on something, then I will be able to have a better response, or I'll know exactly what I need to do when I get back in front of my computer. And so
Mm.
just kind of setting apart that time and making that a real, I think there's so many ways to glamorize the work and glamorize like the end point, but starting to glamorize the thinking and the away from the computer time.
Awesome advice for agency owners, but also just freelancers too. I think sometimes we're like, we've got this big problem. Okay, I'm going to pull up my sleeves and I'm just going to do it. And actually, maybe the opposite is, in fact, what you need to solve the problem. And sometimes, yeah, I found that where you're like, I've got this massive problem, been working on it for 2 hours. I just need to keep pushing. And actually,
Yep.
yeah, just go to the beach for 10 minutes and then come
Yeah.
back and it's
Yeah.
absolutely you've got the answer. So yeah, I really resonate with that. So there's two different kind of platforms or things
Mhm.
that you're working on that I've heard of in this episode. There's this kind of enterprise community platform thing, and then there's joggers um, for webflowers to come together and run, or
Mhm.
maybe anyone.
Walk. Yeah, just get outside. Like, I think I'm gonna set a challenge of like 1 mile a day, or maybe it's like 3 miles a week or 4 miles a week, just like be able to get outside. And for the people that are on the metric system, I'm sorry, like I think that's like 1.4 kilometers or something along those lines,
Yeah.
1.6. it's not as easy to say, but yeah, actually, so for next year, coming out of Webflow conference, the thing that I was thinking about, so there was a lot of talk around like superpowers and how Webflow gives you these superpowers. And so my question has been, and I think the question for you and for a lot of people within the community is like, you know, what will you do with all these powers? What will you do with your superpowers? And that's something that I'm actively kind of working on right now. And I have a lot of ideas there that I'm trying to come emotionally ready to commit to. I think that's probably where I can say I am.
Oh, interesting. So potentially way more than two ideas to come to
I
life, and
actually have four, and that's
four
like
four
outside.
ideas that you're seriously considering.
Yeah, yeah. And so, like Jogger is one. So Jogger is going to happen no matter what. There's something that I'm working on with Nelson, which like there's parts of that which are within our control, and there's parts of this which are within another organization. Um, I really also want, so last year, and then if I was to kind of like put a kind of, full bow on this, you know, if it was a failure last year at Webflow conference, it's that like we weren't nominated for anything. And again, I was kind of like I've never cared about awards, but just like there wasn't any work that we had done that was featured. And I felt like just like, I'd apply to speak and we didn't get to speak. We ended up like becoming a sponsor so that we could go and have like a sponsor slot to be able to talk, but like we weren't as part of the selected group. And so I set out to try to like, I was like, I want to do something that's going to make an impact here. And so coming out of the last no code conference, then I was like, we're going to do something to make a splash. And so Letter Run was sort of part of that. But I was like, okay, great. So I made a splash, and like we become, we're recognized, and now I see like not that we've won an award. I see that it's almost like an ambassadorship. And my question is like, how can I help to, so it's like the question is like, what will you do with all these superpowers? And I feel like we've started to develop some. And the biggest thing that I want to do is like help, other people grow within their agency and then grow more of what we can do within Webflow. And so the four programs that I'm looking at, like one of them is actually, I would love to have a conference, a Webflow conference in Buenos Aires, like that's totally in Spanish, because I feel like and we have a push where we've been investing. So Webflow Cafe, I'm the sponsor of that, but that's really Felix and Florencia and Pablo that are working on that day to day. And like, I don't jump on those streams. Like that is their community. I can be an investor within that community, but really kind of like Webflow with beyond borders, so it's like last year the thing was like, let's push Webflow beyond its limits. Let's go and do something that's like totally ridiculous with like this Three.js stuff. And so now it's like Webflow beyond borders and looking at like how to have other communities, other ways that we can start to kind of gather around the tool, either getting away from the tool or in other languages, or like other groups that we can impact, or starting to look at like how to bring business owners together and have more meaningful conversations. Those are the sort of things that I'm looking at outside of like, even the business, which, I think that's like its whole other thing that, I have that I'm sort of working on.
God, I'm fascinated to hear more about this, but we are coming up to the end of the hour and I realize that you've got to go. So I'm going to wrap this thing up and I'll have to message you another time. Okay, so to finish off this episode, what I love to do is ask people what their next failure is going to be. But I know you're going to call me up on the word failure. So I'm going to use flailure. And I think I
Yep.
should from now on. So what is your next flailure going to be?
I don't know. I think every day is like some type of new failure. And even if anything, I think that um, something that I struggle with is having so many ideas, and then thinking about just like how to be able to bring them to life. And that's the thing that it's like I haven't even talked about like the things, it's like we have big stuff that I want to do within the business around like helping to go up market within Webflow, and like really starting to be what I'd say is like the tip of the spear for the enterprise market, and helping to bring more of these people along that are just starting out and things along those lines, and being able to help them ladder up so that they can get bigger and bigger clients. So that's the thing that I'm probably like, struggling with. But I hope to really, start to have, I think, the emotional commitment to some of those ideas, and be able to share more details of that in the next coming weeks and months.
Okay, I'm so excited to keep track of all of these different. There's
Yeah.
so
And I
many
just,
interesting things you just said. I really want to dig in, but another time.
yeah. And Jack, again, just like, thank you so much for having me on, and, what you're doing. Like, I have such admiration for it. And anyone that's like the commitment that it takes to podcasting, and the commitment that it takes to being able to have a newsletter, and putting things out there. And like, I love the new site that you've put together, and like
Oh,
everything that you're
thanks.
doing within the community, and everyone that you've been able to line up and have a conversation with. And so, yeah, I definitely hope to continue this conversation. I hope it's the one of just many. Obviously, I'll see you on Twitter. And yeah, like, watch out. Like, I will come back from a run and I will be like, Jack, I've got an idea, and you may or may not like it. So
I'm so keen. I think we need another episode together on these,
we could have like a whole episode. There
a
is like,
series. We could do a whole
well,
podcast.
I mean, just even on, like, we didn't even really get to touch on like all the ways that Letterland almost failed.
Yeah, I would
Uh,
love to do like a deep dive on Letterrun. Maybe that would
yeah,
be a really interesting.
yeah, like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, like, we almost, like, 2 weeks before Webflow Conference, like, it wasn't working. So I'll just say that, like,
Wow.
yeah,
Okay, that is going to be the clip that I'm going to put at the start of our Letter Run Flail series. Or maybe we could.
that's
I would love to do that with agency, like websites generally. Like,
yep,
what were the kind of failures? In fact,
yep,
Marcelo Russo from Friends Agency, he suggested this to me. He was like, "There's so many agency like websites that
yeah,
so nearly didn't come to life,
oh yeah,
and it
oh
would
yeah,
be so interesting to like go into those."
oh
But
totally,
anyway, sorry, I realize you have to go.
yeah,
You have been an
yeah.
amazing guest. Thank you so much for coming on.
This has been so much fun. So thanks for having me, everyone. Thanks for listening, and yeah, I'll see everyone on Twitter or just wherever we happen to be on the internet.
Yeah, definitely. And I am looking forward to seeing what amazing things Edgar Allen does in 2023. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening,
Yep.
and
Thank you so much.
see you guys next week. Bye. Okay, that was amazing. Thanks so much. I will
Yeah.
put that together. The edit's going to happen and come out not this week. In fact, your episode's coming out in 2 weeks' time because we got Hamish Duncan.
Okay.
Then we've got Emily Giordano, who I just interviewed, and she says hi to you, by the way,
Oh,
and
awesome.
she
Yeah,
loves you.
you've had a
So
big day.
yeah, it was a biggest guest I've ever had on the podcast. So it's amazing. But I'll let
Man,
you.
you've had like all sorts of people. Like, I was like, man, you've got like Emily talking about community and like all sorts of stuff. I'll give you the preview in terms of what my 4 programs are. So I'm working on Nelson there's a nonprofit group called 48 and 48. They're currently on WordPress, and what they do is they help 48 nonprofits redesign in 48 hours to create 48
Wow.
websites. And I would love to go and take the power of the speed build challenge and apply that for good. And so that's something that
Mm.
we've been working on. I'm putting together what I'm calling uh, an an MBA conference, my minimum business acumen conference, which is
Ooh,
really for
interesting.
business owners that are, they understand like how the Webflow side of this works, but then how to be able to have the understanding of just like, what is a master services agreement? How do you deal with a statement of work? Like, how do you deal with like, what do you do within a playbook, and not playbook, but employee handbook, and like all this stuff.
Mm, mm.
The Webflow conference in Spanish and Jogger. So those are the 4 that I have. And I'm just like trying to, as I said, like kind of emotionally commit and get those in line, and then like how each one of those can benefit like Edgar Allen, but then
Mm.
also like how we can, just make sure that we can fulfill against that.
I've been thinking a lot about Spanish. I studied languages at uni, and
Hmm.
I would love to start interviewing people in their native language because I think the amount of expression people can have when they can just speak
Oh,
freely is
yeah.
such a different experience to if you're trying to speak a second language. And as an interviewer,
Yeah.
obviously I'm asking questions, so I'd need to understand enough, but I kind of thought it would be amazing if I could just ask questions
Yeah.
and let people freely speak, because then it would just open up Webflow, the type of people that I can interview so much more. So I'm
Well,
trying
I'd
to
love to
learn
get you on
French.
oh, you're working on French?
So I studied Spanish and Portuguese at university, and I
Oh,
lived
wow.
in Spain, and I've lived in Brazil, so I can speak those two pretty well. But my
Okay.
cousins are French, so I'm trying to learn
Okay.
French as well. And anyway,
Oh
but yeah,
man. That's outstanding. I'm working on my Spanish. I'm still like
I saw on
I'm
the blog post.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I have 336 days now. But yeah, I'd love to get you on Webflow Cafe.
Oh,
Because
that'd
I
be
know like
amazing.
Valencia would be like really excited about it. And again, just trying to branch out what is the Webflow community and getting into other languages.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that. That would be an incredible opportunity to just get. I think as an English person, I definitely feel like the responsibility to try and speak to people in other languages, just because
Mhm.
most people just assume, like most Brits abroad are like
Yep.
notoriously, not necessarily the most caring of other
Yeah.
languages. So yeah, I think it would be like a huge, like a real pleasure and a big like
Yeah.
responsibility for me in my head. So
Yeah.
yeah, that would be amazing if that's possible.
Oh, totally. Well, let's continue the conversation
Yeah,
and
definitely. I'm
yeah.
so intrigued
Um
with all your different things as well. If you want anything like promoting in the newsletter or
yeah.
anything like that, please do
Yeah, and
let me
like
know.
how are you approaching like sponsorships and things along those lines?
So I've applied for the Webflow community grant, but
Mhm.
I haven't heard anything back. And Marcelo has basically said, "Hey Jack, I want this to carry on because I basically spend about £300 a month on, because I have a podcast editor and things." And he was like, "Jack, I love what you're doing. How can I sponsor?" And I was like, "That's amazing. Thank you, Marcelo." And he's been a really amazing kind of mentor for me. But I'm basically trying to grow the newsletter. There's this podcast, and there's the website. So I'm writing articles and things. And what I'd love to
Cool.
do is to expand it from the Jack Redley show, which it kind of has to be at the
Yep.
start, I guess, because no one really
Yep.
knows what it is, and I need to.
Yeah.
But what I'd love is to have different writers and
Yep.
people with like niche skills, like
Mhm.
SEO, animation, whatever, and
Yep.
have kind
Yep.
of more of a, because I am not, I see myself a lot more as a curator rather than
Mhm.
like a teacher. I'm more
Sure.
just trying to kind of extract advice from people who have far more experience than me. So I'd love Webflail to reflect that more than it does.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Awesome. Well,
that's kind of the
yeah,
concept.
well, I will think about stuff that there's things that you're like really specifically trying to work on. Um, then let me know. But yeah, again, congrats on what you've put together, and I will just look forward to talking with you again soon.
Yeah, definitely. We will do another episode together, and yeah,
Oh
if
yeah.
you want anything promoted on the newsletter, please do. I would love to help in any way I can, because you've given
Oh,
so
thank
much
you.
to the Webflow community. It means a lot.
It's funny. It's like part of that's through anxiety, and like it's just like like whenever I feel like I can't do something for myself, then I'm looking at like, okay, well, what can I be doing just out there in the world? And so if you see me active, it's like Mason must be really anxious right now. So, but
No, I mean, I think you've inspired a lot of agencies to be more like free flowing with their information.
yeah,
And from the YouTube stuff, you've got Webflow Cafe, and it's really inspiring to see. So um,
no.
yeah, I mean, thanks. I'm sure it's
Well,
not just coming out of anxiety. You are
yeah, it
you are
well,
doing amazing things. So
yeah. I mean, it is like definitely from a point of a love for the community and just loving like building stuff on the internet. So, but I'm gonna have to
it's
run.
amazing.
I've
Yes,
got
you
to like
do. Sorry, yeah.
I'm gonna go and meet Claudia actually. So she's in town.
Oh,
Um,
cool. Oh, lush.
yeah,
Yeah,
so we're gonna meet up for lunch.
she's great. I'm actually
Yeah.
speaking to her next Wednesday, so I'll catch
Oh,
up with her as
awesome.
well.
Well,
Yeah,
I'll tell her that you said hello.
yeah, we'll do. Awesome. Thanks so
Cool.
much.
All right. All right. Thanks, Jack. Talk to you
See you,
soon. Okay.
Mason.
Bye.
Bye.